Okay, it's my pleasure today to welcome you. Oh, hi James. On behalf of the Holy Center for Buddhist Studies, and to welcome our guest, Professor Eviatar Shulman, or Tari as he prefers to be known, to address us today. Professor Shulman studied at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel, for his first 2 degrees, and then took his PhD there in 2009. And then after 2 years of postdoctoral fellowship, he was appointed as a senior lecturer at Fuji, and he is still there, where he now has joint appointments in the departments of comparative religion and Asian studies, and where he is now head of the Institute for the Study of History, Religion and Culture. He is the author of approximately 50 publications, including among the books a couple of translations of Hebrew translations of Buddhist texts, one being the very important Mula Madhyamaka Karika of Nagarjuna, and the other being a selection of ancient Buddhist poetry, which I suppose, Tari, is the Theravāda and Theravāda?
No, the Atthakavagga, Parayanavagga, and a few others in the study pattern.
Okay, and then we have in 2014 Rethinking the Buddha, Early Buddhist Philosophy as Meditative Perception, and then more recently in 2021 Visions of the Buddha, Creative Dimensions of Early Buddhist Scripture. And then forthcoming, or maybe it's been published yet, a co-edited volume called Perspectives of Consciousness, highlighting subjective experience. Is that out yet?
It's out.
It's out. So in addition to that, many book chapters and journal articles on a wide range of topics falling into the general areas of Buddhist literature, including poetry, as we've just heard, Buddhist philosophy and meditation practice. But I think one thing that distinguishes Tari's work is a concern to explore the connections and linkages between those fields, as you can see in the titles of much of what he's published. He's certainly well known for thinking outside the box, if I dare say that, right? Richard Gombrich once rather uncharitably observed that Buddhist studies was an intellectual backwater whose calm surface is rarely roiled by disagreements, but in Tari's case he's managed to provoke a few of those, which I think is a very good thing, to have people excited about discussing various aspects of the Buddhist tradition and rather strongly disagreeing with each other. So thank you for stirring up the waters a bit. So today he's going to address us on the Buddhist ethic, a path to the annihilation of suffering, or to equanimity. So welcome to Stanford, and thank you very much.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, Paul, for the introduction, for inviting me, and Irene and Leah for taking care of everything, and thank you everybody for showing up. This may be the new stir, kind of outside of the box thinking. I mean, I thought this is like a kind of pretty straightforward article that I could just write and maybe even read to you guys. I think I was told to have a PowerPoint and give an interesting talk rather than read a paper. But aside from that, it proved to be something bigger than I understood, and it may be like the next kind of project. And so, yeah, I mean, the pictures are kind of just meant to say, well, actually, in a sense, I've answered the question in the original title, right? So usually we think of Buddhism as an effort to annihilate suffering. And I think we're ready to move to a more positive formulation, which I'm not 100% sure exactly what to call, but I think equanimity would be the best candidate, or a good candidate, and I'll show you some specific reasons why I choose equanimity, which also focus on specific passages and texts that I think are very important and underemphasized, but they connect to other themes that recommend that we think of Buddhism more positively, actually, more as ultimately, I'd say, a cultivation of consciousness rather than as an attempt to end something. Similarly, selflessness will be shown as a positive doctrine, not as a negative one. It's a way to speak of continuity in a way, or the nature of consciousness, or even call it the nature of selfhood, or which without a self. So I'm trying to define a Buddhist ethic. I think it's time to do that for different reasons. I'm not sure there is a Buddhist ethic or one Buddhist ethic. I mean, I'm sure there's not one Buddhist ethic. So of course, this is like a kind of generalization, and it's an interpretation. But I do think that there's room for a new conceptualization of Buddhism. I don't know, maybe it's too big a term. When I'm speaking about ethic, I mean that you know, an ethic that, like the values of Buddhism, to define them in a way that is not only relevant for monks who are practicing some advanced state of meditation, for example, and also to understand what they're looking for. So I've been focusing more in the past decade at least, or more actually, on Pali materials. This is not like drawing on any Mahayana philosophy or anything. This is more kind of like basic Buddhism. Call it Pali, call it Theravāda, maybe Indic or Indian Buddhism. I'm sure it would be different, you know, for, say, we look into 8th century China, we may see a different ethic there. Or we may see different periods in China or in Cambodia or anywhere. You'll see different, you could define different ethics, but still, I do think that I'm kind of touching on something that is like central to the tradition. That when Buddhism is kind of being absorbed into a new country, something of this understanding is coming in. And it's not about saying, oh, life is shit, let's quit it. It's about producing positive states of mind. Like karma is a doctrine that's meant to scare you from being bad, but it's also meant to teach you to be good. And that has benefits. And the benefits are something people encounter in their experience, and they communicate with others. And that's kind of what I'm after. So I said this is like a bigger project than I anticipated. And just to say that, you know, if I'd give you like 6 talks, so I'd give one on Buddhist ethics. This will be, you'll see, I'll be talking about Buddhist ethics and the scholarly understanding of, or debates within Buddhist ethics. It's a whole field, or actually it's a set of fields in a way. Then there's like, you know, the age-old question about, is the path directed to a meditative state, a kind of shamatha, jhāna, samādhi, a deep concentration, or is the Buddhist transformation, call it a state of understanding, for example, understanding selflessness or pratitya samutpada or any one of these doctrines. So say you'd have a positive intellectual vision. And there's been, I don't know how many of you study these kind of things, but this is like the big debate. Goes back to De La Valle-Poussin in 36, 37 articles. We don't have those anymore. An article that was published over 2 years. I'm not sure what that is, but that's the classic. And then you have Schmidt, you have lots of people doing this. So it's also here. I mean, if the path is aimed at some deep nirodha, so that will tell you something about the ethic. And so you kind of have to decide what you want to do with that. But I'm not sure, actually, that the question of the path is necessarily so important. And people usually, even if the trade is headed to some final destination, some deep nibbana, nirvana or something, I'm not sure everybody really makes it to the last stop, right? Most of us stick around on the train, right? And then on the train, we need to know how to relate to each other. And we want to be better passengers on the train for ourselves and for society. And Buddhism is very good at doing that, I think. And so this is like, I want to provide a language or say that it's important that we have that language. I'm not saying that Buddhism is not interested in the end of suffering. I'm just saying it doesn't capture enough. And I'll show you why I'm troubled by this issue of suffering. I just think, okay, I'll say this in a sec, okay? Or I'll say it now if it came up. So anyhow, it's just not such a self-evident thing that say, so say I'm a bit anxious now, right? Because I'm giving the talk and I was anxious all day. So is Buddhism just going to help me solve that anxiety? First of all, I doubt it, right? That it can really do that, or that it would have to do that. Is that all it's trying to... Is that the suffering that they're interested in, though? That's the question. That kind of anxiety that I'm maybe... We're all feeling some anxiety. I think Buddhism is very interested in anxiety. Life is full of it. Dukkha, I don't know, that's a good translation for today. Today, the times, just call it anxiety. Yeah, in that sense, sure, Buddhism's going to help us with that. But I don't think it's just trying to help us deal with self-evident qualities that we can identify and understand in our experience. I think it's actually trying to culture a new kind of consciousness, which is the same consciousness, just could be a little better day by day. Okay, so when I say the Buddhist ethic of equanimity, then there's also specific questions of what equanimity is. I'm actually not sure that upekkhā, for Pali, or upekkhā, is always best translated as equanimity. I think in specific places it's actually a very subtle form of care. I don't know how effective it is. I'll be talking about that a bit. And then there's questions about the understanding of selflessness. I raised that already. There's specific things within Abhidharma or Abhidhamma, and that's like a separate talk. But I'll be ending with materials from Abhidhamma, Pali Abhidhamma. And then there's these questions, another whole set of questions coming from the way Buddhism learned to express itself in the modern world and provide this psychological language of ending suffering. So, how much is that a new thing? How much does that represent the older tradition? I won't be talking about that here. Okay? So here's my question, all right? I don't think I need to bring 100 quotes to just say that people generally think that Buddhism is interested in ending suffering. And by the way, they don't think it for no reason, and I'll give you a couple quotes from the text in the next slide showing that this is clearly something that's important to the tradition. I just don't think it exhausts it. Take either one of these, the picture you like best. Say the monk in the middle who's meditating. I think that's an AI image. Looking for pictures now for your PowerPoint, you get a lot of AI. I'm not sure, but I like this one, okay? So, we could play the game of what do we see, what is he feeling, what do we understand? I just don't think he's only stopping stuff. He's producing a positive state of mind. And certainly the guy on the right, which we identify as the Buddha, I don't know if anybody here has read Charlie Hallisey's dissertation from 1988. I think it's the most important work ever produced in Buddhist studies. It hasn't... Maybe, Paul, you could get him to publish it. This is recorded now, so... he wants to, I think. So he writes... It's about what he calls mamayana. The path of mindness. The Buddha came here just for me, to show me the way. He came to this world with all its pain and went through all this suffering, even for me, that I'm unworthy. And this is like this is a conception of the Buddha that is active in medieval Sri Lanka. And he shows this through these Sinhala manuals that are kind of the next version based on the Atthakathas, and it's very, very moving, okay? If you go to I was talking to Mark Blum yesterday Berkeley, right? This Shinran Buddhism. It can't be that, the Buddha taught something that no one can reach, that is, or just for one guy, two guys. It's got to be for everybody. Everybody, that's Buddha nature, right? So I'm just saying that the way this guy on the right is understood in Buddhist societies is not just like as someone who reached some utter calm and disappeared into nothingness. There's a positive gift that he's given to the world. And this is part of what the Buddhist ethic is about. And so when this guy is giving these, I guess that's papayas or coconuts, to the monk in what is the paradigmatic religious action, ritualized act of giving in any Buddhist society. So this active moment of generosity is, maybe that's the most important. Maybe we should say the ethic of generosity. That's also a really important value. Actually, it will come up here at the end of the talk. So you could say he's doing this because he wants to be reborn as a god. Okay, this is like the doctrinal formulation, right? The monk will meditate, will do good acts so that we're reborn in higher realms. And beware not to do bad acts because you may be a preta or you may be in hell. But there's something kind of more simple going on. There's something, the way, so for example, this act of giving, it does something very positive to the mind. Try it. Generosity is just a really, really good thing. And I'm just saying that I don't think any of these pictures, which are like paradigmatic pictures of Buddhism, the Buddha, the meditating monk, and the householder and the monk in a more regular setting, I don't think any of these things are necessarily about ending suffering. I think they're looking for some positive values. So my goals in the project, I guess I've been saying enough of this along the way, is to define Buddhism in a way that is relevant for society. I'm actually not achieving enough of that today. I'm not translating, I'm more in the monkish mode in a way. So the guy who is giving gifts, he won't only be successfully Buddhist because he's valorating the meditating monk or the monk who represents or actually embodies the Buddha in a way. So there's the old conception as if like there's the path to Nibbana and the Kamadic Buddhism, Nibbanic Buddhism, these kind of things. We don't really think like that anymore. But I don't think we've made it all the way to say that monastics and lay people are doing the same thing, but just at a more intense way, at a higher resolution. Everybody's practicing the Dharma. Everybody's working. So there may be an end that is empty to this. But nonetheless, everybody's circulating around it. Nobody's really ever there. So this is a positive ethic. That's basically, the whole picture. And I'm actually trying to shape a refuge for Buddhism from the limiting framework of uprooting suffering, and what I think is actually a simplistic presentation of the Four Noble Truths. It's not just like I can say, oh, I'm going to stop attachment and, okay, I'm not going to be attached to the aggregates anymore. It's not really something you can do. It's like a kind of very general theory. And then within Buddhist ethics, there's a dominance of Mahayana thought and a particular interpretation of selflessness. These are issues in scholarly understanding. And I'm also searching for an adequate psychological theorization of Buddhist insight. You mentioned this book that I've done with neuroscientists, and I've been working with psychologists, and there's so much in Buddhism that the positive understanding of selflessness fits the way brain science understands, neuroscience understands the brain. There's no self, there's no center of authority. There's no one guy moving the joystick. There's no seat of the soul or seat of consciousness or seat of the self. There's all these multiple drafts, like Daniel Dennett said. So there's a movement, a coordination of all these. Anyhow, I'm just trying to say, I think this theorization based on equanimity may prove to be more helpful in the long run. Or maybe we're just ready for another stage. Just to say that I'm not arguing with straw men, I'm arguing with guys like Jay Garfield or everybody. I just want you to see the price I think we're paying for this kind of insistence on the language of annihilating suffering. So here's Jay Garfield in his very interesting book on Buddhist ethics, characteristically kind of compelling in his language and drawing us into his vision. He says the first truth, that of the ubiquity of suffering, sets the problem that Buddhism proposed to solve. The universe is pervaded by suffering and the causes of suffering. The Buddha did not set out to prove this at Sarnath. He took it as a datum, one that is obvious to anyone upon serious reflection. I don't know. We're all suffering a little bit here, but I hope it's not all that bad. If one disagrees with this statement, here's where this is what I wanted to highlight. Buddhist moral discourse has no basis. There would be no problem to be solved. If you just love headaches, don't bother taking aspirin. If you don't like them, you might consider how to obtain relief. Similarly, if the world and your life are really fine, Buddhism may not have much to say to you. Okay? So I just think there's no problem. I mean, there is a problem. There are problems. There are real problems. There's a lot of dukkha around. There's the anxiety. I suffer all the time. Okay? I'm not trying to avoid that observation. But I don't think Buddhism is only trying to solve a problem. It's trying to create a better reality, and it's doing it by a positive understanding of the mind and how it works, and it's trying to culture the mind in new ways, and even a doctrine like selflessness is working in this direction. So, just to say, a guy like Garfield or the many people who have highlighted this, they weren't taking it from nowhere. You all know the Four Noble Truths, and you know that in what's considered the first discourse, of course, it was reworked 100 times until we read it today. But the Buddha says that desire causes suffering. Mind you, the way he defines suffering, again, isn't quite our regular quotidian suffering, right? Birth is suffering. I don't know, and of course, old age and death. I don't know. I'm not that old to say it, but I don't think it's only suffering. And anyhow, I should have brought the quote in, but it's not just about things we can identify in our regular daily life. It ends by saying that the five aggregates are suffering. The five aggregates of clinging, the five aggregates which are clinging, are suffering. So this isn't our headache. This is something much, much deeper, so long as we're talking about suffering. It's not something you can cure with aspirin. And then the Satipatthana has this quote, which you can read, or the formulation of dependent origination on the cessation of this whole. It's very prevalent. It's clearly one of the goals of Buddhism. I'm not denying it, okay? But texts that speak of the end or the cessation, the nirodha, of suffering are normally found in the Samyutta Nikaya or the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Pali. Maybe different in the Chinese. I haven't looked at that. And I put up some of my articles that are behind some of the points I'm making. But in this article, I show it's about the Bhānakas. It ends up being an article about the distinction between the Majjhima Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, you can't get enlightened without jhāna. In the Samyutta Nikaya, you don't need jhāna at all. The old debate is one that is actually between different interpretations within each tradition. The Samyutta is the analytical mode. The jhana is the narrative mode, the majjhima is the narrative mode, and the more kind of jhanic mode, maybe because it's interested in producing a certain image of the meditative monk. I'm just saying that it's just, so long as we're thinking Buddhism and trying to define a logic, like Garfield is, and they were doing this, then the language of the end of suffering is more available. But it's not necessarily there. So this is in the more analytical approach, which requires a reflective cognition or understanding, then you'll be speaking about the end of suffering. So when you're selling it to the West or to yourself, when you're trying to modernize as a Buddhist in Sri Lanka, 19th century, and you start conceptualizing it, so this kind of language becomes more available. Or here, this is a text from the Samyutta. You guys, you have handouts, and now they begin to come relevant. There are a couple more here if anybody hasn't got one. Take a look at this quote, though. When you kind of listen to the language of the text, the suffering thereafter is not our headaches or our anxiety. It's something much, much deeper. So the Buddha says, excellent. When you will see the I clearly, now we are in Samyutta Nikaya, Book 4. Book 4 means we're talking about the senses. The Samyutta Nikaya is not a collection of texts, it's a method for generating texts. Okay, this is another point. There's a lot behind what I'm saying. This is the work I've been doing over the past decade, is a kind of reformulation of how we actually read the text, what they actually are. And it's again in this article that I make a kind of transition to show that, so within the fourth book of the Samyutta Nikaya, there's a method for talking about the senses. And within it, you would reach a statement like this about the six senses, right? The five senses we normally count in the mind. And the objects that they perceive. And the consciousness that accompanies each one of them. And the contact of the sense, the object, and the consciousness. For example, the contact of the I, the form, and the consciousness. And the Vedana, the feelings that are based on the contact. So they like to work with this fivefold distinction of the cognitive realm, maybe we would call it. The whole cognitive realm. Does that work? The senses, their object, any cognition or consciousness, cognition, vijnana, and any moment that cognition arises, when, for example, we're seeing each other or hearing each other right now, or you're hearing me, and the feelings that arise, all these are suffering. I mean, here the Buddha says, when you will see the I clearly in this way, with correct wisdom, as it is, it just doesn't really come through in English all the way. But it has to be clearly seen, means there's an embodied, I have this up here, an embodied cognition of selflessness. Okay, you have to really see it. That any moment of vision, that any cognitive episode is not the self. With this formulaic element, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Neta mama nesohamasmi, neta mama nesohamasmi na meso atati, same formula. This is the end of suffering. Okay? So when you really see this in an embodied cognition, then supposedly the attachment kind of subsides. You let go. They have their own formula for liberation. Evam passam, once you see in this way, Suttavarya Savako, the noble disciple, he nibindati, he kind of detaches in relation to the I, and again, I can count the five, I hope you got them. going through each of the senses, and from detaching there's a dispassion, viraga, and viraga vimucchati, following the lack of passion, he's liberated, and he knows kinaja, then you get the formula of liberation. This is liberation in the Samyutta Nikaya, no jhana. It's always this way. And when it appears in the Majjhima, it's brought in from there. I'm just saying this is much deeper than the headache, okay? Or my anxiety here. It's any cognitive moment. It's not my suffering. It's like the fact of having cognition is already suffering. And it may be something that they're interested in, but they're interested in other things, okay? And one way to speak of this is that to understand that this embodied cognition appears, so there's no self that is observing, but there is a real subjectivity. There's a mind, a consciousness that is perceiving. And that's, I think, one of the most deepest understandings of Buddhism. It's kind of Kantian in the sense that there's nothing we get that is not through our mental capacities, and you got to culture that. You got to work on it, make it better. And so what I'm calling the ethic of equanimity is I think, one of the finer ways to speak in this vein. And here's just a quote that the first time I read it really blew my mind. I was memorizing actually the book. I made it about 100 discourses in. So here's another samyutta. These are all formulas, they kind of copy paste them here and there. This is, I'm quoting you a specific text from the Samyutta Nikaya. I give the VRI versions. I don't give the Pali Text Society. If I should have known this was recorded, I would have put the Pali Text Society quotes, you'd have found them. But this, you just go to the number in VRI. And here the Buddha, but it appears in different places. And the Buddha asks a group of monks, what happens if you're meeting some other renunciates, and they say, well, why are you guys doing brahmacharya under the Buddha's guidance? And the monks are very wise. They know to say, we're towards the end of suffering. But then the Buddha says, what if they were to ask you, what is that suffering? Which is it? Kattamam tam dukkham. Like, the question is amazing. Because if suffering was just, our suffering, he wouldn't need to ask it. If it was just our headaches or my anxiety, so fine. But if we need to ask what it is, and the thing is, you'll get different answers when this question is placed in the text. And here, so what is the suffering, or which? I don't, the kattamam doesn't really somewhere between a what and a which. And then he says, the I is the suffering towards which we live the holy life, towards the understanding of which, sorry, I missed it in the translation, we live the holy life under the reclusive forms, eye consciousness, eye contact, the same kind of sequence I went through earlier. So I'm just saying, there's something, we're tricking ourselves with the language of suffering. It's not really that. If we want to go for that, we got to give up the whole cognitive realm. All we're left with is nirodha. And that would be like the one value, a kind of silence unheard, nibbana. Okay. So I'm sure many Buddhists were interested in this in many places. Different kinds of nirodha. Maybe if you quiet everything, there's a pure light. I'm sure lots of Zen practitioners have these kind of mystical visions, or in India or in Tibet. I'm sure, I'm not saying that this is not important to the way Buddhism thinks of itself. And then I think, Buddhism is a human endeavor. There shouldn't be one way they think. And I think that this positive language of equanimity is going to offer us some help out of that one language, which I don't think dominated Buddhist societies. So, I want to say generally, and this is an article that came out recently and I've been getting good responses about it. I use the meditation on brahma-vihāra, and that's really like my main thing. I don't know, I'm probably behind time. But, so I don't know how far I'll make it into this stuff, but I'll be talking about brahma-vihāra. This is, in a sense, my case, okay? That equanimity is cultured through brahma-vihāra, through metta, maitri, these care, love, and compassion, and sympathy. And I'll show you a bunch of quotes. And it's also moving and beautiful. And upekkhā comes out of that. So I don't think it's just a kind of, certainly not an indifference. I don't think it has some affective quality. But I'm saying this within a conception of the path as a flexible path. And the way I argued in this article is that there are lots of texts in the Nikayas in which the Buddha teaches the brahma-vihāras and people get liberation, like boom, right away. And it's not supposed to be that way because you're supposed to do the jhānas and get the understandings, or you have these different models of how to get enlightenment, but this isn't one of them. Brahma-vihāras are more like a technique to kind of clean the mind of negativity or something like that. So the idea is that there's not one path. We want, we're monotheists in our mindset. We want to start from A and reach Z, and there'll be, clear paths along the way, and the Magga, the Buddhist path, will have a clear trajectory. I think it's more like I should have put this up here, the map of the metro. You got many lines intersecting. There's lots of peaks. There's lots of paths. It's a range. It's not a peak, one peak. And then, but you see that the main deep meditative states are all going towards upekkhā. That's like part of my main argument to say that this is, a dominant value in the tradition. Or maybe this isn't, at least a dominant quality. I should say something else. All right, I think this comes up. So, for example, what I said is that there are different maps. Some of them emphasize meditation, some of them intellectual understanding, most of them mix. And there's endless presentations. Once you get into this and you kind of let go of it needing to be one thing, they're playing with it. Schmidhausen made this point beautifully in 1981. It's a creative tradition that is working through its inner tensions, and it's creating new states along the way all the time. And it's just, we didn't listen to him actually well enough. So the 4 jhanas end in upekkhā. Okay, the 4th jhana is characterized. I didn't give you the English translation, I guess. But what this says in the 3rd jhana, he abides with upekkhā, and it's said a couple of times. And in the 4th jhana, he enters and abides in the 4th jhana, which is beyond dukkha and sukha, and it's characterized by upekkhā, equanimity, sati, mindfulness, and purity. But then if you're like in a more samyutta mode, we don't do the jhanas there. We have a different map. It's called the 7 limbs of enlightenment, the bojjhaṅgas. And here you go, and very much the same terms, but some differences that work from sati, mindfulness, through Dhammavichaya, which is an analysis of the dhammas that appear, the phenomena, and then virya and piti was this kind of blissful experience that happens normally in the 1st jhana and the 2nd jhana, and then passaddhi is a kind of tranquility, and then you get samādhi, which is like the whole jhana thing, and you end in equanimity. And then also in the 4 brahma-vihāras, which are another type of deep meditative state, maybe not as deep, and we're not going to have time to talk about this, but you'll see this in some of the slides if you read them carefully, that for the tradition, brahma-vihāras, they're very much wrapped into the jhanas, and upekkhā only happens in the last jhanas, but the other ones are ways to enter them. So yeah, I hope you know this, and I'll say a little more in a minute. There are many different combinations that are available, but you have these are the main paths of meditation, aside from, the Nirodha cessation state or the advanced formless states. And they're all directed towards upekkhā. And you would think, you could argue, if you're into this kind of stuff, that, so I'm just talking about the path of meditation, calm, samādhi, samatha, or shamatha, as opposed to a vipassana path. But you got a series of texts up here in which are actually vipassana oriented. And actually, it's interesting that they appear, all of these texts here that I've quoted appear in the last section, the last 50 discourses of the Majjhima Nikaya. So here too, the Majjhima has different parts. Jan, we can talk about this, that the last 50 are part of an Abhidharma mode. And they're doing a kind of vipassana. Not all of them. There are lots of different texts there. They're a kind of a later layer. And here, for example, in the Dhatuvibhanga Sutta, so you have the Buddha, it's a really weird text, that the Buddha is teaching some guy that the commentary says is a king, but I think he's like a garbage cleaner, and he's living in some shack of some potter or something like that. There's something really kind of evocative about the framing of the story, and the Buddha gets that he's like some serious practitioner, and they sit and meditate together all night, and you know, the Buddha knows other people's minds, and he's like, oh, this is some really serious thing. And so he teaches him this kind of vipassana-oriented teaching, which is very irregular. So he tells him he can observe the different elements, like the earth and water and wind and fire and space and consciousness. And then he reaches this state where the only consciousness remains. And then he's observing the feelings, and he kind of sees the Vedanas that are sukha and that are dukkha, or neither, and then he reaches this upekkhā, and only upekkhā remains, and that's it. And anyhow, yeah, I didn't quote this, it's too long and complicated, but if you read it, this language of changing the quality of consciousness works for this text very well. Observing even the formless states as conditioned, then this is, yeah, all right, I won't enter, this is like a kind of complicated epicycle within the theories of liberation. So here's another one, where this is the last text in the Majjhima Nikaya. The editors of the Majjhima Nikaya were serious people. They knew how to strategically place texts. It's really powerful in the first 50. I won't tell you that story now. They're very funny stories at the end of the first 50 that caricature the first discourses, and they really make a joke out of the whole Buddhist thing. And here the Buddha says, here is where you see. So the Buddha is seeing these different experiences, and they're either pleasant or unpleasant or neither. And then he sees these, and he knows that they're conditioned, and he moves to another realm, which is it's the same formulation that you get to speak about asankata dhatu, like the unconditioned, or amata, the deathless, and here it's just called upekkhā. So these are complicated workings of the relation between vipassana and some deep attainment. Sorry if this is just like the tip of the iceberg, all right? I'm happy to talk more about these things. Moving to upekkhā itself, I'm just calling it upekkhā because I've become a Pali guy, okay? We can call it upekkha, we can call it equanimity. I'm not sure there's one way to call it. It's not always the same thing. In Abhidhamma, it becomes a kind of neutral quality, not much in it, okay? But it really depends where you're looking and what you're reading. And we'll read Buddhaghosa in a second. You can tell me what you read here. I'm not 100% sure how to read him. There's a tension within his text. So supposedly upekkhā is not a kind of indifference or a dumbness, so it's an evenness, a sameness, an equality, like a kind of witnessing, like Nyanamoli translates this bojjhaṅga, like a kind of Sankhya view of a witness, a suction. I just like that translation. I don't think it's correct, though. But these are the kind of words that come up, this samatha, a sameness. And we'll talk about this sameness in a minute and whether it's caring or not. And I think it is. So I'd say that upekkhā, if I would have more patience to read slowly the last quotes, you would have seen pretty clearly that it's a mode of attention. It has a positive frequency, of the mind. It's like a buzz, but a very soft and quiet one. And you need to cultivate it. You need to learn to use it, or you need to culture your consciousness to become it. One way to do it is by reducing attachment to self, by reducing maybe excitement about the senses, by dealing with certain kinds of suffering. But then you also have to culture a certain way of seeing. So generally, this should have been up in the previous slide about the different meditative schemes. But basically, think of the path this way. This shouldn't surprise you. You start with sila, you get into meditation, samādhi, and then wisdom arises, paññā. How the wisdom and the meditation connect is a kind of complex issue. I'm sorry I raised that. The point is that in order to get into meditation, you need an ethical mind. You need to calm the mind. It has to be a little less excited, less interested in all these sense objects. It has to detach from akusala states, from akusala tendencies. Only then can you get samādhi. And then maybe we should think of samādhi as a kind of densification of that ethical quality. Mindfulness can often be the bridge, sati. The practices of mindfulness train your attention in certain ways. They create new habits. The whole thing is about creating a more kusala mind. So, this ethical quality, I would say, intensifies and it culminates in upekkhā. But where we really see, but these may be different upekkhās, okay? Maybe the jhāna upekkhā is a little different. But so long as we're looking at brahma-vihāra, which is what we'll do now, and brahma-vihāra has been a very important practice historically in the Buddhist traditions, especially in Theravāda. If you look at the kind of materials Kate Crosby studies, and Andrew Skilton, these people at Oxford who are reading all these, what they call the esoteric Theravāda, the Kamatana texts, Kamatana. So they're full of these brahma-vihāras. This is like really central to the practice. And this doesn't really work, kind of linguistically, but I would like to have been able to say that upekkhā should mean care, in the sense that it's an iksh, it's a form of seeing, the verb is iksh, and upa, kind of like we have Upanishad when we say it's sitting near the teacher, so seeing something is near to you is something that is close to you. But it doesn't really mean that, in the dictionaries at least, or in the way the term is used in the literature. So, just to kind of evoke your appreciation of what these states are. I'm sure you know the Metta Sutta, the Karaniya Metta Sutta, probably the #1 text in Theravada societies. You hear it on the radio in Theravada countries, morning and evening. This is like the main parita. We had monks doing parita or in their parita shack up at the beginning of the PowerPoint. There was a picture I was going to explain. But this is like the main text. Householders know this. And it's wishing every being, whether they is seen or unseen or gross or small or, to be happy. And then it says, Matayatan yamputtam ayusai kaputam anurake. Just like a mother would guard her only son with her life, one should cultivate a boundless mind towards all creatures, a boundless mind of care for the whole world. Yeah. It would be nice if we could do it, right? That's why you recite it so much. In the Visuddhimagga, so the Visuddhimagga, in case you don't know, is like the main manual for that kind of puts together the whole path of practice in the Theravāda tradition. And there's a very interesting chapter about the brahma-vihāras. And it's mostly focused on metta. The other states are kind of derivative of it. So when he's explaining it, he tells a lot of Jataka stories. So say, let's choose Prince Dhammapala. I'm not quite sure why, because I only read this summary in Buddhaghosa now. I didn't go back to look at the Jatakas themselves. But his father wants to kill him, and he's cut off his 4 limbs. And he gives the order to cut off the boy's head. This is the future Buddha, his Bodhisattva in a previous rebirth. His mom's crying, she can't believe it. And he's working very hard to maintain a mind that is not defiled by hate. Because he knows that, do I have this quote up here? He knows that he doesn't want to give rise to a mind of hate, because this is what's going to ruin his karmic destiny, or his, maybe better say, conscious potential, or maybe that's a good term to use. So he doesn't want to be angry towards the people who are hurting him or towards his father, and he's trying to keep a mind of sameness towards his mother too, and towards himself. And he's a little baby aware of all this. Or maybe there's a couple stories about the classic King Chadanta, you may know, or the Great Monkey, or I guess I kept the Snake King. Anyhow, they're going through torture, and they're not going to they're not going to defile their consciousness. That's one of the main modes of explanation. A more surprising one, perhaps, is the way Buddhaghosa speaks. He's like it's Shantideva. I couldn't believe it when we were reading this. Of the lack of boundary between self and others, sima sambheda. So he says, let's say that the 4 of us, he's got these 4, so my dear friend, or someone I care about, someone who I'm kind of indifferent towards, and my enemy, and myself. All 4 of us are sitting together, and some Rujas come and say, all right, why don't you come with us? We're going to cut up your throat and take your blood and use it for offerings. I don't know if I was kind of tough enough. You're supposed to feel a really bad samvega now. And if you're thinking, okay, take me, you haven't attained that impartiality that he's expecting of you, to have a complete lack of boundary between self and other. And this is a subtle point, okay? This is Shantideva's classic, well-known formulation. A lot has been written about this in the 8th chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara, and it's the foundation of the way people do Buddhist ethics. Not everybody, but most of the discussion of Buddhist ethics, this is like the peak of it all. And Garfield's point, or people like Garfield, his group, are saying that it's completely irrational to make any distinction between self and other because we have no self. They have a deconstructive vision of selflessness. They only think of selflessness as that thing that breaks down and there's no bottom and there's just nothing there, really. I mean, not a nihilistic nothing, but it's what Sideritz calls mereological nihilism. There's no positive element that remains. Here, let me show you this, okay? I'll come right back. I think I have Graham Priest here. On selflessness. Now, you are exactly like your car, just made up of parts. The car doesn't drive itself. Except that your parts are psychological. And just as the car has no self, something that persists through all the changes and makes the car the very car it is, neither do you. And see right above that, the distinction between self and other has no substance. So that's the foundation for a lot of the discussion of Buddhist ethics today. And what I want to say is that it's too strong. The fact that, for example, there's no real boundary between me and Paul doesn't mean that we're not distinct entities, distinct subjectivities, distinct forms of consciousness. Maybe I think we have shared consciousness in many ways. The very fact that we can be here together and somehow understand each other, I think it's a fact we don't know how to account for in our kind of modern epistemology, and there are shared forms of consciousness. But generally, most of us, at the end of the day, all of us are going to go and continue our own real stream of consciousnness, and that's what these guides are after, to improve it. I just want to read you this beautiful text. This is verses, I don't think they've been identified, nobody found them, but just pick up the feel. And I don't know if you guys study Shantideva, but if you've ever read it, I mean, it's like a really, really amazing text. And here's Buddhaghosa doing the same thing, but a little different. It has somehow a different feel. He's trying to tell you not to be angry at your enemy. That's the point. To develop a mind of love. And my overall point is that the kind of love he wants us to develop and to avoid hate is part of a positive movement. That's all I'm saying. If pain was caused to you by an enemy in a domain he can control, meaning he can hit my body, why do you wish to cause pain in your own mind, a domain outside his control? So I'm going to get angry because he hit me. Now I'm doing the pain to myself. You left your family, assuming you're a monk or a monastic, so helpful to you in tears. They're crying. So why not leave your anger, your enemy that causes so much vice? Anger severs the root of those practices of morality you guard so well. Why indulge in it like a jerk? You're angry, saying, this ignoble deed was done to me by another. Why do you wish to do to yourself the very same thing? If another, wishing to harm you, did something unpleasant to you, why do you fulfill his wish by giving rise to anger? He's trying to hurt me. I'm going to hurt myself much more because I'm getting angry, because I'm ruining my mind. You, angry, may cause him pain or not. Okay, I'm going to hit him. I may hit him well or not. He may get hurt or he may not. Yet you bind yourself now to the very pain of anger. If enemies set off on the path of anger and harm, why do you follow them getting angry? Why are you being like them? Based on your anger, your rival did something painful. He responded to my anger. That's why he hit me. Cut that very, based on your anger, your rival did something painful. Cut that very anger. You will not be troubled when it is not there. And this kind of also Mahayana kind of argument. Things are momentary, so the very aggregates that did you harm have now passed away. At whom are you angry at now? He who causes pain to another, without him, who will he hurt? Right? You need yourself in order to get into this. You are the own cause of your own pain. Who are you angry at? That's Shantideva there, rising to the sky as he tells the Bodhicharya avatar. It's, deep here in the Visuddhimagga, which is an interesting fact, it's like a side point. So, okay, what this was trying to say, I didn't get into karuna, compassion, or mudita, which is also like this, happiness in other people's happiness. It's also, I should have brought that. It's actually really beautiful. They're very interesting analyses in this text. I'm just trying to make the point that upekkhā is emerging through these states. At least part of upekkhā. And now let's try to read this a bit slowly. These are all my translations of Buddhaghosa's characterization of upekkhā. I'm going to skip the beginning, which is about the relation between upekkhā and the jhānas, and it's a complex system that involves some Abhidharma. Seeing the benefits in equanimity that results, I'm in the middle there, that results from its own calm nature, as well as the danger in the earlier brahma-vihāra states that result from the coarseness, did I skip? As well as the danger, yeah, that result from the, okay, here, this is the danger. So the earlier states are coarse because they're associated with pleasant feelings. And they occur in the vicinity of enmity and friendlessness, right? They're taking you like to a kind of positive, attractive reaction or a negative, kind of aggressive one. They're in that vicinity, is what he says, samipa. And they're connected to paying attention to the fun experiences living beings experience through statements like, may all beings be happy. So once you notice the point, I think the point here is that it's just a little coarse. These other emotions are not fine enough. He wants a finer version of them that is not reactive. I don't know if it's effective or not effective at all, but it's not responsive. It doesn't get worked up. And then, also it's interesting, you see here that he's observing this upekkhā. Upekkhā is an action. It's often talked about as something you do. It's not just like some kind of state it's a way of looking. It's a specific way of looking. That's the way it appears in the Nikayas quite often. And then you would direct this kind of attention towards someone who you're not, who's like a middling person for you. You don't like him too much or dislike him. But see this quote that he brings from the Vibhanga. And of course my translation will kind of direct your attention a certain way. It's really difficult to translate these words because we don't have the right terms, but nevertheless it seems to say, how should a bhikkhu abide having pervaded one direction with a mind accompanied by equanimity? This is the formula from the brahma-vihāra formula. He's quoting the Vibhanga, it's an Abhidhamma text. Just as he is indifferent, upekkhā, I translate here indifferent, when he observes a person who is neither agreeable nor disagreeable to him, that's why I say indifferent. I don't know what else to say. In the same way, he should pervade all beings with equanimity. So while the beginning is like, so I don't know, I mean, there are different ways to read this. There may just be a kind of vector here towards some kind of deep quiet, and I'm trying to ignore that. But there are other sides to it of seeking a positive cultivation of the mind. And I would say that the better reading here is one that takes upekkhā as a subtle form of care, a very subtle form of care. The question is, how deep does the lack of enmity and friendlessness go? Is nothing effective left at that stage? And I think different interpretations are available and relevant. I don't think there's one answer. Equanimity has this is still Buddhaghosa, has the characteristic of generating the form of indifference towards living beings. Its function is seeing sameness. Its manifestation is the appeasement of enmity and friendlessness. Its proximate cause is in seeing ownership of undertaken actions thus. Basically seeing that people are owners of their own karma. He's got this interesting way of defining the near enemy and the far enemy of each one of these states. So the near enemy is the indifference of the lack of understanding based in the household life. It's a kind of more regular form of indifference, which has no real understanding yet. Because they share a lack of interest in faults and virtues, both a kind of ignorance and upekkhā are not, delving into the positive qualities of people or their negative faults. Okay, I guess this was a bit much, and I'm getting short on time. I read you this thing about, so Graham Priest does have an interesting, so basically, okay, a moment of Buddhist ethics. Graham Priest has an interesting article in which he says, if everything is suffering, why not commit suicide? Assuming a kind of naturalist framework in which, we don't persist after our brain dies or something like that. So if everything is suffering, let's just kill ourselves. And that's not a really good Buddhist position, of course, right? And there's a way to answer this within the Buddhist framework, but it's a compelling point, and the way he answered is to say that Buddhism is directed towards a positive quality, a peace of mind, which he calls upekkhā. So in a sense, I'm working within this kind of framework, and okay, I guess maybe this is like the distinctions here are too fine, and let me skip. And maybe I should just, there's a lot of stuff here in Buddhist ethics, and we're not going to get through it. Okay. Okay, I will say that a lot of the discussion in Buddhist ethics concerned what's called meta-ethics. What kind of ethical theory are the Buddhists developing? And there's a debate whether Buddhism is a virtue ethic, with Damien Kean offering the classic formulation that a lot of people don't like, that Buddhism is a virtue ethic in the Aristotelian mode, which is developing a kind of type of happiness, which he calls nibbana. And there's a lot of problems with his, but this is kind of what I'm working with. I'm just saying, I don't think nibbana is the goal. I think something like upekkhā is the ideal, and people realize it in different intensities. And when I'm saying this, I'm using a lot of the different kinds of formulations of Buddhist ethics, including ones, Garfield has a very interesting concept, he's not the only one, of moral phenomenology, but saying that the goal of a Buddhist ethical system is to teach you to see things. And that means that you kind of become sensitive to the moment. That's why people like Garfield or Hallisey or in Hanner, other people have spoken of a particularist ethic or a pluralist ethic or a contextualist ethic, as if it's about learning to see morally within the phenomenology of a present moment. So what I'm saying, that a better way to define the moral phenomenology Garfield is interested in is through upekkhā rather than through ending suffering. And I'm sorry if that's not clear enough, because I don't have enough time to go through all the arguments. I do want to make one more move with the positive notion of selflessness and end with Abhidhamma, which is my new thing, and I'm all excited about Abhidharma now. What's interesting about it, is this is just like to, knock you over completely. So we all learn that the self reduces to the aggregates, and maybe the aggregates reduce until, turtles all the way down, that kind of thing. Anyhow, what I'm saying is that the better logic to speak of selflessness is the logic of conditionality. I'm not saying much about the problems with these other views of selflessness. But dependent origination tells us that this mental moment is conditioned by the previous moment, and that happens within a certain subjectivity. Abhidhamma is interested in defining subjectivity. And I'm going to give you just a couple just quick examples from the two first Abhidhamma texts, just to say I've been doing all this work on the Dhammasangani. It counts 112 states of consciousness in my calculation. I can show you it. 104,000 of those are positive states of mind, kusala. 12 are negative. Don't be so worried. We only have 12 negative states of mind. We have so many positive states. There are another 9,000 or so that are undetermined. And these are also actually mostly positive in their experience, but they're undetermined in the sense that they don't have a causal force that is creating new states of mind. The thing is that this whole very, very complicated system is actually, its core is to help, I guess, teachers or practitioners identify how important a state of consciousness is, and that the central conditioning factor from moment to moment is the moral quality of consciousness, whether it's kusala or akusala. And then the abhyakhata is a more complicated thing. And, okay, I'll skip this. This is like a picture. Just look at so many terms. This is an X-ray of your mind at this very moment. There are all these different factors that are active in it, all these dhammas. And this is just one means state of mind number one. And depends how you count, you make it to 89 according to the traditional classification, but here you actually make it to 112,888 if my count is correct. Each one of them has their own mix of states. They're really interested in positive states. This is what they're talking about. This is what they're learning to teach and cultivate and to direct your mind in a positive vein. And I'm just going to end with this. Right, I see I have one more slide. So I hope it's maybe not really the full end, but I'll just read this, which is a really, really surprising text in the Vibhanga, deep down in the middle. This is just the regular formula of dependent origination. And it's doing all this complicated stuff like they like to do. But suddenly they want to tell us what a positive sequence of conditioning would look like, what a moment of generosity would look like. So say you would start, and he's asking, like the Dhammasaya, okay, I can't explain that. At that time, based on the conditioning of the good root, the kusala mula. So right now, okay, just generate a kind of positive intention, just that the world will be a little bit better. That's it. You got a positive root. You got that, the formations that arise, the sankharas, and then the vijnana, cognition or consciousness, and namarupa, or actually here it's just nama because it's some particularity of the text, and then the six senses, and the contact, and the feelings, and after feelings we're supposed to get desire. But instead of that we get pasada, we get this grace. And instead of upadana, attachment, we get a resolution, a kind of clarity, adhimokkha, based on that pasada. And then we can continue with the whole kind of mass of suffering or whatever. I find this a very, very significant statement that demonstrates the way they're thinking about these positive modes of attention, about the value of consciousness. And then just to summarize all this, I'm saying that we should, and I don't know if I gave you enough examples, or as I said, it's a bigger project than I anticipated, and I'm sorry if a lot of this was too fast. It's the beginning of something. Another AI picture you see up there. So it's a positive ethic, not just the removal of suffering, but cultivating consciousness toward upekkhā or other values. I just think it's like, in many ways, there are reasons to think of it as the kind of gravitational point of the system in a way. On the metaphysical level, there are different ideas. I didn't get much into this, but I think that the reductive view of selflessness is not giving us full picture of the doctrine because it misses the affirming of perspective and subjectivity and consciousness and conditionality, which is very important to the tradition. And with the ethics is an enculturation of consciousness. There's a virtue ethic of upekkhā, moral phenomena. Yeah. Okay, I didn't explain that enough, but all right, that's it. Thank you.